From ancient scrolls to modern classics, welcome to Whispers of Japanese Tales.
The Dancing Girl by Mori Ogai. The coal was already fully loaded. Around the table in the second-class cabin, it was very quiet, and even the radiant glow of the incandescent lamp seemed futile. Tonight, the card-playing companions who usually gathered here nightly were staying at a hotel, leaving me alone aboard the ship. It was 5 years ago. Having fulfilled my long-held desire and received an official order for travel abroad, I arrived at this port of Saigon. At that time, everything I saw and heard was entirely new to me. I wrote travel essays daily, filling thousands of words, which were published in newspapers and celebrated by the public. However, looking back now, I see those writings as filled with immature thoughts and reckless remarks, lacking awareness of my own standing. Even common plants, animals, minerals, and customs, I recorded as if they were marvels. I wonder how those writings must have appeared to discerning readers. This time, the notebook I bought intending to keep a journal during my journey remains blank. It is not because I may have cultivated a certain nil admirari disposition during my studies in Germany. There is, in fact, another reason for this. Indeed, the self now returning to the East is no longer the same as the self who once sailed to the West. While there remains much in the realm of learning that leaves my heart unsatisfied, I have come to know the uncertainties of the world. It goes without saying that trusting others is difficult, and I have also realized how easily even my own heart can change. Who would I show these fleeting impressions, where yesterday's right becomes today's wrong, if I were to commit them to paper? This, perhaps, is why I have not kept a journal. No, there is yet another reason for this. It has already been over 20 days since we departed the port of Brindisi. Ordinarily, even with unfamiliar fellow passengers, it is customary during a voyage to forge relationships and comfort one another against the tedium of travel. Yet, feigning a slight illness, I have confined myself to my cabin, speaking little even to my fellow travelers. This is because I have been consumed by a private grievance, burdening only my own mind with its weight. This grievance first brushed against my heart like a fleeting wisp of cloud, leaving me unable to appreciate the scenery of the Swiss mountains or linger over the ancient ruins of Italy. Later, it deepened to a point where I despised the world, lamented my own existence, and bore a torment so severe it felt as though my very intestines twisted in anguish daily. Now, it is hardened in the depths of my heart into a singular shadow. Yet, each time I read something or observe something, it stirs an endless sense of nostalgia, like a reflection in a mirror or an echo to a sound, repeatedly tormenting my heart. How can I dispel this grievance? Were it another sorrow, I might feel some relief after expressing it in poetry or song. But this alone is etched too deeply into my heart, and I doubt such ease is possible. Yet, tonight, there is no one around, and it will be some time before the steward comes to turn off the electric light. So, let me attempt to weave the outline of this tale into words. From an early age, I received a strict upbringing in our household. Though I lost my father at a young age, I did not falter in my studies. Whether during my days at the old feudal domains academy, while attending a preparatory school in Tokyo, or after enrolling in the university's law department, the name Oda Toyotoro was always listed at the top of the class. This must have been a source of comfort for my mother, who relied on me, her only child, as her support in navigating life. At the age of 19, I received the title of bachelor, a distinction said to be unparalleled since the university's founding. I entered service at a certain ministry, called my mother from our hometown to the capital, and spent 3 joyous years together. Having earned special recognition from my superior, I was given the order to travel abroad and investigate the operations of a particular department. With a heart eager to establish my name and elevate my family's status, I felt emboldened. Parting from my mother, who was over 50 years old, did not seem so sorrowful at the time. Thus, I left home and traveled far to the city of Berlin. I stood in the heart of this new European metropolis, armed with a vague ambition for fame and a disciplined capacity for study. What brilliance was it that sought to dazzle my eyes? What allure was it that sought to ensnare my heart? When translated as under the linden trees, one might imagine a tranquil and serene setting. But come to Unter den Linden, that grand boulevard as straight as a strand of hair, and behold the crowds of men and women marching along the stone-paved sidewalks on either side. Proud-chested and high-shouldered officers strolled about, as it was the era when Wilhelm I still gazed over the city from his palace windows. Everywhere, in their vividly adorned ceremonial uniforms or Paris-inspired attire, beautiful maidens with striking looks captured the eye. Not a single sight failed to astonish. On the asphalt-paved roadways, various carriages glided silently by, while in the spaces where the towering buildings momentarily gave way, fountains surged and spilled in a roar like summer rain against the clear sky. In the distance, beyond the Brandenburg Gate, the lush green branches intertwined, framing the goddess atop the triumphal arch, floating halfway to the heavens. With all these scenes concentrated within a glance, it is little wonder that a newcomer to this place would find themselves overwhelmed and unable to process it all. Yet within my heart, I held a vow never to be swayed by fleeting spectacles of beauty, no matter what marvelous sights I might encounter. I steadfastly resisted the external influences that sought to captivate me. When I pulled the bell cord and arranged an audience, presenting my official letter of introduction to the Prussian officials and explaining the purpose of my visit from the East, they all received me warmly. They assured me that, provided the formalities through the embassy were completed without issue, they would gladly teach and share anything I sought to learn. What brought me joy was that I had studied German and French in my hometown. Upon first meeting me, they never failed to ask where and when I had acquired such knowledge. Then, whenever I had free time from my official duties, and having already obtained the necessary permission, I enrolled at the local university to study political science, having my name duly recorded in the registry. As 1 month and then 2 passed, the official meetings concluded, and the investigations progressed steadily. Urgent matters were compiled into reports and sent off, while less pressing ones were copied and recorded, resulting in the production of several volumes. At the university, contrary to the naive assumptions I had entertained, there was no specialized course designed explicitly for aspiring politicians. Torn between various options, I finally decided to attend the lectures of 2 or 3 legal scholars. Paying the required fees, I began attending and listening to their teachings. Thus, the 3 years passed like a dream. Yet, when the time comes, one cannot easily conceal their preferences and inclinations. Having followed my father's dying wishes and my mother's teachings, I diligently studied, delighting in the praise of those who called me a prodigy. Later, I worked tirelessly, driven by the joy of being recognized by my superiors as a capable employee. Through it all, I remained a mechanical, unthinking being, unaware of my own nature. Now, at 25 years of age, having long been exposed to the liberating atmosphere of the university, I find an inexplicable unrest within my heart. It is as though the true self, long hidden deep within, has finally begun to emerge, challenging the self that I was until yesterday. I have come to realize that I am ill-suited to becoming a politician poised for great achievements in this world, nor am I fit to become a legal professional capable of reciting the codes and rendering judgments in court. I secretly think to myself, my mother sought to make me a living dictionary, while my superior perhaps hoped to make me a living embodiment of the law. Becoming a dictionary, I might still endure, but to become the law itself is something I cannot bear. Until now, I had responded with the utmost care even to trivial matters. However, from this period onward, in my communications with my superior, I began to argue repeatedly that it was unnecessary to become entangled in the minutiae of legal codes. I asserted boldly that once the essence of the law was understood, the countless complexities would fall away as easily as splitting bamboo. At the university, I turned my attention away from the lectures on law, instead gravitating toward history and literature. Gradually, I entered the realm where one begins to savor the sweetness of the cane. My superior likely intended to mold me into a tool to be used as he pleased. How could he possibly welcome a man with independent thoughts and an uncommon demeanor? My position at the time was precarious. Yet, this alone was not sufficient to overturn my standing. Complicating matters, there existed an unpleasant relationship between me and a certain influential faction among the students studying in Berlin. These individuals harbored suspicion toward me and, in the end, went so far as to slander me. Yet even this was not without reason. Those individuals attributed my refusal to join them in raising a beer glass or taking up a billiard cue to a stubborn disposition or a self-imposed restraint on desire, mocking and envying me for it. However, this was because they did not truly understand me. Even I myself did not fully grasp the reasons behind my actions. How then could others possibly understand? My heart is like the leaves of the mimosa tree, shrinking and retreating at the slightest touch. My heart is like that of a maiden. From a young age, I followed the teachings of my elders, pursuing the path of learning and walking the path of service, not out of courage or resolve, but rather through a strength born of endurance and perseverance. What appeared to be determination was, in truth, self-deception, deceiving not only myself but others as well. I merely followed the single path laid out for me by others, never straying. The fact that I remained unmoved by external distractions was not due to the courage to discard and disregard worldly things, but simply because I feared those external forces and bound my own hands and feet in response. Before leaving my hometown, I had no doubt in my abilities as a capable individual and firmly believed in my heart's resilience. But that too was a fleeting moment. Until the ship departed Yokohama, I had thought myself a bold and valiant figure, yet I found my handkerchief dampened with unstoppable tears, a reaction that even I found strange. And yet, this was indeed my true nature. Was this disposition something I was born with? Or was it perhaps a result of losing my father early in life and being raised by my mother's hand? Their mockery is one thing, but is it not foolish of them to envy me? This heart of mine, so weak and pitiable. When I see women with their faces painted red and white, clad in dazzlingly bright dresses, seated in cafes enticing customers, I lack the courage to approach them. When I see Lebemann, those men of high society in Prussia, wearing tall hats and pince nez, speaking with aristocratic nasal tones, I lack the courage to engage with them either. Lacking such courage, I could not even interact with my lively compatriots. Because of this estrangement, those people not only mocked and envied me but also came to distrust me. This, indeed, was the very cause that led to me being burdened with false accusations and subjected, in a short time, to immeasurable hardships and trials. One evening, I was strolling through the zoo, passing Unter den Linden, and heading back to my residence on Montbijou Street when I found myself in front of an old temple in the cloister alley. Having crossed the sea of lights, I entered this narrow and dimly lit alley. Before me stood a house with laundry drying on a wooden balcony above, still waiting to be brought in, clothes and undergarments left out. A long-bearded elderly Jewish man stood in front of a tavern, his figure framed against the doorway. One ladder led directly to the upper floor, while another reached the home of a blacksmith, leading to a small dwelling nestled in the corner of a courtyard. As I gazed upon these buildings, remnants of a time 300 years past, a sense of deep wonder overcame me, and I found myself standing there for an unknowable length of time, lost in thought. As I was about to pass this place, I saw a girl, no more than 16 or 17 years old, leaning against the closed temple gate, silently weeping with her voice choked. Her hair, which escaped from beneath her headscarf, had a pale golden hue, and her clothes, though seemingly worn, appeared unsoiled. Startled by the sound of my footsteps, she turned to look at me. Yet, without the poet's pen, I could not capture her image in words. Her eyes, so clear and blue, seemed to hold a quiet sorrow, as if silently asking a question. Half covered by long lashes that glistened as though touched by dew, they pierced through my guarded heart with a single glance. Why was it that, merely by looking at her, my innermost feelings were laid bare? She was consumed by some deep sorrow, standing there with no time to look around, crying without pause. My own timid heart, overcome by compassion, could not help but draw closer to her, unconsciously leaning toward her in a moment of shared vulnerability. "Why do you weep?" I began to ask. Perhaps there is some way I can offer assistance, for even a foreigner might lend a hand when it is needed. But as I spoke, I was taken aback by my own boldness. She was startled and shielded her face, her expression showing that my sincere, straightforward words had reached her. "You seem to be a good person," she said. "You are not cruel, like others. You are like my mother." And with that, the well of her tears, previously dried, overflowed once more, streaming down her lovely cheeks. "Save me, kind sir," she pleaded. "I wish to live without shame." My mother, refusing to heed my father's words, struck me. "My father is dead. Tomorrow, I will be buried, and there is not a single coin saved at home." After that, only the sound of her sobs filled the air. My gaze was fixed on the trembling nape of the girl's neck as she lowered her head. "Before you take me home, please calm yourself," I said. "Do not let your voice be heard by others. This is a public place." As she continued to speak, I felt her lean unknowingly against my shoulder. At that moment, she suddenly lifted her head, as if for the first time noticing me. She blushed and quickly jumped away, embarrassed. Not wanting to be seen by others, I hurriedly followed her as she walked briskly. Upon entering the large gate facing the temple, I saw a broken stone ladder. We climbed it, and at the 4th level, there was a door just low enough to require us to stoop and crawl through. The girl twisted the end of a rusted wire and, gripping it firmly, pulled with all her strength. From within came the hoarse, raspy voice of an old woman asking, "Who is it?" Before we could even answer, saying it's Elis returning, the door was abruptly flung open. The old woman stood there, her hair half turned gray, not appearing especially ill-natured, but bearing the unmistakable marks of hardship. Her face, etched with the lines of suffering, showed the signs of poverty. She wore an old, worn-out garment made of animal fleece and dirty shoes. As Elis nodded to me and entered, the door was slammed shut abruptly, as though the old woman had been waiting impatiently. I stood there for a moment, stunned, but then, through the faint glow of the oil lamp, I saw the door and noticed that it was inscribed with the name Ernst Weigert in lacquered characters, with Taylor written beneath it as a note. This, I realized, must be the name of the girl's father. Inside, I could hear voices as if they were arguing, but soon the noise died down, and the door was opened again. The elderly woman, with great courtesy, apologized for her earlier rude behavior and invited me inside. The room was a modest kitchen. On the right-hand side, A low window displayed freshly washed linen spread out to dry. On the left, there was a rudely stacked brick stove. The door to the room in front was partially open, revealing a bed covered with white linen. The person lying there seemed to be without life. She opened the door next to the stove and guided me in. This room, facing the so-called mansard street, was a small space without a ceiling. From the attic in the corner, slanted beams stretched diagonally toward the window, covered with paper. Below these beams, in the area where one would stand and bump their head, lay a bed. In the center of the room, a beautiful rug was spread over a table, upon which were a few books and a photo album, along with a flower arrangement in a porcelain vase, incongruent with the room's modest setting. Beside it, the girl stood, her face flushed with embarrassment. She was extraordinarily beautiful. Her face, the color of fresh milk, was gently illuminated by the light of the lamp, with a faint rosy hue. Her delicate, slender hands and feet were unlike those of a typical poor woman. After the elderly woman left the room, the girl spoke in a slightly accented voice. "Forgive me, I regret bringing you this far. You must be a good person. You will not come to hate me, I hope. Tomorrow, the funeral of my father will take place. I had placed my trust in Schomburg. You must not know him, but he was the leader of the Victoria Theatre troupe. Having been with them for 2 years, he had always seemed to want to help us, but now, seizing upon our misfortune, he seemed to be trying to make selfish demands. Save me, kind sir. I will repay you with the little salary I earn. Even if I must go without food, I will repay you. And if that is not possible, I will adhere to my mother's words." Tears welled up in his eyes as he trembled. In his gaze, there was a certain charm that left no room for refusal. Was he aware of the effect of his gaze, or was it unconscious? I had a few mark coins hidden away, but it was not enough to suffice. So, I took off my watch and placed it on the table. "Use this to get through this urgent moment. When you go to the pawn shop at 3 Monbijou Street, ask for Oda, and you should be able to receive its value." The girl appeared shocked and moved, and as I extended my hand in farewell, she pressed it to her lips. In that moment, hot tears fell and splashed onto the back of my hand. Ah, what a strange twist of fate this was! To repay me for this kindness, the girl who had come to my residence, placed Schopenhauer to her right and Schiller to her left, spending the entire day sitting quietly beneath the window where I read, as if one beautiful flower had bloomed in the midst of my books. From that moment on, the connection between the girl and me grew gradually, and since it was unknown to even our fellow townspeople, they soon began to speculate that I, too, was part of the circle of dancers and revelers. Between the two of us, only foolish and naive pleasures existed. Though I hesitate to name them, there were those among our fellow townspeople who took pleasure in spreading rumors. They reported to my superior that I frequently visited the theater and associated with actresses. The superior, who already resented my apparent deviation from the path of study, finally relayed this information to the embassy, leading to the dismissal of my official duties and the termination of my position. When the ambassador delivered this order to me, he said, "If you return to your hometown immediately, we will provide you with travel expenses. However, if you remain here, you must not seek any further public assistance." I asked for a week's grace, uncertain about how to proceed, and during this time, I received 2 letters that caused me the deepest sorrow of my life. These 2 letters, though almost sent at the same time, were very different. One was written by my mother herself, and the other by a relative, informing me of my mother's death, the death of the one I had longed for so deeply. I cannot bring myself to repeat the words from my mother's letter here, as tears welled up and prevented me from continuing to write. Until this moment, my relationship with Elis had appeared, to the outside world, to be pure and untainted. Due to his father's poverty, he was unable to receive a proper education. At the age of 15, he responded to the request of a dance teacher and learned this shameful profession. After completing his crucis training, he joined the Victoria Theatre and now holds the second highest position on stage. Yet, as the poet Hackrendell once said, the fate of a dancer is fragile and fleeting, much like that of a slave in contemporary society. Bound by a meager salary, she was relentlessly used, with daytime rehearsals and nighttime performances. When entering the dressing room, she would don her makeup, and in beautiful costumes, she would perform on stage, but outside of that, she often struggled to afford even the basics of food and clothing. As for her family, how difficult it must have been to support relatives under such conditions. It is rare for someone in their profession to avoid falling into the most degrading of circumstances. Elis, however, escaped this fate, thanks to her gentle nature and the protective care of her strong-willed father. Since his childhood, he had a fondness for reading, though the books he could obtain were the lowly novels from the Corpula Tuju, a small lending library. However, after becoming acquainted with me, he began reading the books I had borrowed, gradually developing a taste for literature, correcting his accent, and even minimizing the number of errors in his own letters addressed to me. In this way, a teacher-student relationship formed between us. When he heard of my sudden dismissal from my post, he lost all color from his face. I had concealed the matter of his involvement with me, but he asked me to keep it a secret from my mother. This was because he feared that my mother would grow distant from me upon learning that I had lost my scholarship. It is unnecessary to delve too deeply into the details here, but at that moment, my feelings of affection for him suddenly grew stronger, and it was then that I found it impossible to part from him. At a time when the most crucial matters of my life lay before me, and when I was truly facing a period of danger and possible ruin, there were those who questioned and criticized my actions. Yet, my feelings of love for Elis, from the very first time we met, were not superficial. Now, as I looked at her, moved by the tragic turn of events, and as I saw her face, filled with sorrow at our impending separation, with her hair loose and disheveled, that beautiful, pitiful figure pierced through my troubled mind. In my state of deep emotion, a feeling of rapture overcame me, making it impossible to think clearly. What could I do? The day I had promised to the ambassador was fast approaching, and my fate seemed sealed. If I were to return to my hometown now, I would be burdened with disgrace, having failed to complete my studies. Yet, to stay and continue would be impossible without the means to secure my education. At this moment, the one who came to my aid was Aizawa Kenkiki, a companion of mine. He was in Tokyo, already serving as the secretary to Baron Amagata. Upon seeing my name in the official announcement of my dismissal, he spoke to the editor-in-chief of a certain newspaper and arranged for me to become the correspondent for their publication. I was to remain in Berlin, reporting on matters related to political science and other studies. Although the compensation from the newspaper was not substantial, by changing my lodging and choosing more modest dining establishments, I could make do with a modest living. As I was pondering these thoughts, it was Elis who, with sincerity in her heart, extended a lifeline to me. Somehow, she had managed to convince her mother, and I was able to take up residence in their home. Without even realizing when it happened, Elis and I began to pool together whatever modest income we had, spending our days with more joy than sorrow despite the hardships we faced. When the morning coffee at the cafe was finished, he went to his studies, and on other days he stayed at home. I went to the narrow, deep resting place in the middle of Kiyonihi Street, where I read all kinds of newspapers, took out my pencil, and gathered materials. In a room where light entered through a partly opened window, young men without a fixed occupation, old men who lent money they didn't have and spent their time in leisure, and merchants who stole time away from their work at the exchange to rest their feet, sat side by side. On a cold stone table, they hurriedly wrote with their pens, paying no mind to the cold coffee brought by a little girl. Newspapers, now old and narrow, were inserted between them, and on the wall, long strips of them were hung, each bearing various types of writing. Those who passed by repeatedly, without knowing the people inside, must have wondered what was going on. As the time approached, on the days when he went to his studies, he would pass by on his way home and, together with me, leave the shop. There must have been people who watched with suspicion the light, almost carefree, dance of the young girl, who seemed capable of such a delicate movement. My studies had grown desolate. A faint light burned in the attic, and when Elis returned from the theater, she sat by the chair and sewed. At the desk beside her, I wrote newspaper manuscripts. In the past, when I gathered the withered leaves of old laws and articles on paper, it was something quite different. Now I combined critiques of the lively political movements, new phenomena in literature and art, and other such things. To the best of my ability, I sought to learn more from Heine than from Björne, shaping my thoughts accordingly. Among the various writings I created, I continued to report in great detail on matters such as the deaths of Emperor Wilhelm I and Frederick III of France, the ascension of the new emperor, and the future of Count Bismarck's political career. Thus, from this time onward, I became busier than I had expected. I leafed through many books I had not previously examined, and it became difficult to revisit old pursuits. Though my university enrollment had not yet been withdrawn, the difficulty of earning a living made it rare for me to attend lectures, which had become a singular commitment. My studies had grown desolate. However, I developed a certain kind of perspective. How should I put it? It seems that the spread of popular knowledge was most prominent in Germany among the European nations. In the debates found in hundreds of newspapers and magazines, there were many that were exceedingly noble, and since the day I became a correspondent, I read and reread them with the discerning eye that I had cultivated during my frequent visits to the university. As I copied them again and again, the knowledge that had once followed a single path gradually became more comprehensive and systematic. Many of my fellow countrymen studying abroad had reached a level they could not have imagined in their dreams. Among them, some did not even read the editorials of German newspapers properly. The winter of the 21st year of the Meiji era arrived. On the main street, one could scatter sand and swing a broom, and though the area around Crosstell Street might appear uneven and rugged, the surface was completely covered in ice. When the door was opened in the morning, it was sorrowful to see sparrows that had frozen to death from hunger. Even when the room was warmed and the stove was stoked, the cold from the stone walls and the harsh northern European chill, which pierced through the cotton in one's clothes, was almost unbearable. A few nights ago, Elis had collapsed on stage and was helped home by others. Since then, she had felt unwell, and after eating, she would vomit. It was her mother who first suspected it might be morning sickness. Even though I am uncertain about my own future, what should I do if this is truly the case? This morning, it is Sunday, so I am at home, but my heart is not at ease. Elis is not bedridden, but she sits quietly by the small iron stove, speaking little. At this moment, there is a voice at the door, and soon Elis's mother, who had been in the kitchen, brings a letter and hands it to me. Upon seeing it, I recognized the handwriting of Izawa, and the postage stamp was from Prussia, with a cancellation mark from Berlin. Though I was puzzled, I opened the letter to read it. It was a sudden matter, and I had not been informed in advance, but it said that last night, the minister from the heavenly court had arrived here. He expressed a desire to see me and urged me to come quickly. It was mentioned that this was the moment for me to restore my honor. The letter conveyed a sense of urgency, focusing only on the matter at hand. Upon finishing reading, seeing my dazed expression, Elis said, "Is it a letter from your hometown? I hope it is not bad news." She likely thought it was a letter regarding the usual payment from the newspaper company. No, don't worry, I replied. It is from Izawa, whom you know by name. He is here with the minister and has called for me. If he says it's urgent, then I must go at once. The mother, who had just sent off her beloved only child, would not have used her heart in such a manner. Thinking that I might meet the minister, Elis, though ill, mustered the strength to rise. She carefully chose an upper garment that was exceptionally white, and, with great care, brought out the gaiter coat with 2 rows of buttons, which she had put away neatly, and helped me into it. She even tied the collar for me herself. With this, no one will say you look unsightly. Look into the mirror. Why do you show such a displeased expression? I, too, wish to go with you, she said, as she slightly adjusted my appearance. No, when I see you in such attire, somehow it doesn't seem like my Toyotaro, she said, after a moment of thought. Even if you should one day rise to wealth and honor, you will not abandon me, even if my illness is not as my mother predicted. What's this about wealth? I smiled. It's been years since I gave up any hopes of entering politics or society. I have no wish to see the minister, only to meet a friend whom I haven't seen in many years, I said. Elis, called by her mother, entered the droshka, which reached the snowy path beneath the window. I put on my gloves, threw my slightly soiled overcoat over my shoulders without putting my arms through the sleeves, took off my hat, and kissed Elis goodbye as I descended from the tower. She opened the frozen window and let the harsh wind tousle my hair as she saw me off in the carriage. The carriage stopped at the entrance of the Kaiserhof. The gatekeeper asked the secretary, Izawa, for the room number. I climbed the marble staircase, which I was not accustomed to, and entered the front room, where a zafa covered with Prussian cloth was placed at the central column. A mirror stood in front. There, I took off my overcoat and, following the hallway, made my way to the room, pausing slightly before entering. Izawa, who had once greatly praised my upright conduct during our time at university, I wondered what kind of expression he would have when he welcomed me today. When I entered the room and saw him face to face, his appearance, compared to how he looked before, had become more robust and powerful, though his cheerful demeanor remained unchanged. It seemed he didn't pay much heed to my past failings. There is no need to go into detail about the feelings after our separation, but I was summoned and had an audience with the minister. The task entrusted to me was to translate an urgent document written in German. When I received the document and left the minister's room, Izawa came after me, saying he would like to have lunch together. At the dining table, he asked many questions, and I provided many answers. His life path had generally been smooth, while the peculiar twists and turns of fate had been mine to bear. Upon hearing the unfortunate events of my life as I opened my heart and told my story, he was often taken aback, but he did not attempt to reproach me. Instead, he returned to criticize the other ordinary students. However, when the story ended, he straightened his posture and, as if to offer advice, said that this episode had stemmed from a naturally weak heart, and that there was no point in speaking further about it now. Upon hearing the unfortunate experiences I shared, he was often astonished, but he did not scold me. Instead, he turned to criticize the other ordinary students. However, when the story ended, he straightened his posture and, as if to offer counsel, said that this particular matter arose from a naturally weak heart, and that there was no point in saying anything further about it now. Show this and seek the trust of the Duke. As for the relationship with that girl, even if there was sincerity on his part, or even if the emotional connection had deepened, It is not born out of recognizing talent, but rather from a certain inertia born of convention. Make up your mind and cut ties with her. This was the general gist of his words. Like sailors who have lost their way in the vast ocean, gazing toward a distant mountain, the future that Aizawa pointed out to me was similarly uncertain. Yet this mountain remains shrouded in thick mist, and whether I will reach it, or even if I do, it is uncertain whether it will bring satisfaction to my soul. Amidst poverty, my current life has its joys, and what is hardest to forsake is Ilis's love. My weak heart had not made a firm decision, but for a time, I resolved to follow my friend's advice and sever this emotional bond. I did not wish to lose my principles, and while I would resist anything that went against my own beliefs, I could never outright refuse a friend. As I left, the wind struck my face. I had just exited the dining room of the hotel, where the double-glass windows were tightly shut, and a large stove was burning. The cold of the afternoon at 4 o'clock, with only a thin overcoat, was especially hard to endure. And as the chill raised goosebumps on my skin, I felt a certain coldness in my heart as well. The translation was completed overnight. My visits to the Kaiserhof gradually became more frequent. At first, the Duke's words were solely about business, but later he began to mention things from his hometown and ask for my opinions. From time to time, he would tell amusing stories about the mistakes people had made on their travels, laughing as he recounted them. About a month later, one day, the Duke suddenly turned to me and said, "I will depart for Russia tomorrow. Would you like to accompany me?" For several days, I had not seen Aizawa, who was caught up in his official duties, so this question came as a surprise to me. "How could I not follow your command?" I said, eager to show no shame. This answer was not one that had been quickly decided upon. When someone whom I trusted and relied upon suddenly asks me something, in that fleeting moment, I do not always take the time to carefully consider the scope of my response, and thus, at times, I give an immediate answer without fully measuring it. Although I did not fully understand the reason for my decision at the time, and despite feeling unsure, I hid the emptiness of my heart and endured, often carrying out what was expected of me. On that day, instead of the translation fee, I returned with travel expenses as well, and entrusted the fee for the translation to Ilis. This would cover the expenses until I returned from Russia. He had gone to see a doctor, and it was said that his condition was unusual. It was due to anemia, and perhaps I had been worried about it for several months. Since I had been resting for such a long time, I was told that my enrollment was removed. It had only been about a month, but the strictness seemed to be due to some reason. It appeared that the matter of departure did not cause me much distress. He trusted my sincere heart deeply. Since the journey was not far by rail, I did not prepare much. I wore the black formal suit I had borrowed, and packed only the newly purchased coat of arms of the Russian nobility, along with 2 or 3 dictionaries, into a small bag. Indeed, as I felt many uncertainties in these recent days, I feared that if I left, I would leave behind sorrowful memories, and if I were to shed tears at the station, I would feel embarrassed. Therefore, I sent Ilis to her mother early the next morning, entrusting her to a trusted acquaintance. I prepared for the journey, locked the door, and handed the key to the shoemaker who lived at the entrance before I left. As for the journey to Russia, what should I say about it? My mission, as an envoy, quickly took me away and cast me high above the clouds. While I was in St. Petersburg with the minister's party, I was surrounded by the Parisian grandeur, which had been transplanted into a palace adorned with ice and snow. The lavish decorations, with countless candles lit in yellow wax, reflected the light of countless medals and epaulets. The fire in the intricately crafted camins warmed the room, allowing the palace maids to forget the cold, and the fluttering of their fans added to the atmosphere. Since I was the one who spoke French most fluently, I found myself often negotiating and explaining matters between the hosts and guests. During this time, I did not forget Ilis. No, he sent me letters every day, so I could not forget him. On the day I departed, I felt a particular sadness in being alone before the light of the lamp, and I spent the evening talking with friends until nightfall. Afterward, I returned home, exhausted, and immediately went to sleep. The next morning, when I woke, I wondered in my dreams if I had truly been left behind, alone. The feeling of loneliness when I awoke, the struggle to make a living, and even on days when I had no food for the day, these were not unfamiliar. This was the outline of his first letter. As time passed, his letters became heavier and more poignant, as if they had been written with great effort. The letter began with the character no, as in no to all else. No, it is now that I truly understand the depth of my feelings for you. If you say that you have no trusted family in your hometown, then if there is a way to make a good living here, what would prevent you from staying? And my love will not easily let you go. But if you must return to the East, it would be easy to go with your parents. But where will you obtain the considerable funds required for such a journey? Though I had always thought to stay here and wait for the day you would rise in the world, once you left on what was meant to be a short journey, the feeling of separation grew stronger each passing day. I had thought that parting would only be a brief moment of sorrow, but that was a misunderstanding. As my own circumstances gradually became clearer, I realized that, no matter what may come, I should never be abandoned. I have had many disagreements with my mother. Yet, as I look back on my past, I find that I am not disheartened by the determination I once made. When I go east, I have distant relatives in the farming villages near Stettin, and I plan to stay with them. As you wrote, if the minister treats you with great favor, the money for my journey will come in time. For now, I am waiting solely for the day you will return to Berlin. It is only by reading this letter that I have begun to see my own position clearly. The shame I feel is due to my dull heart. I took pride in the decisions I made, both regarding my own fate and the affairs of others, believing that I had clarity in my judgments. However, this clarity existed only in times of prosperity, not adversity. When I try to reflect on my relationships with others, the mirror of my heart, which I relied on, becomes clouded. The minister has already shown great favor toward me. Yet, my short-sightedness allowed me to see only the duties I had already fulfilled. As for connecting my future hopes to this, God alone knows, for I never even thought of it. Yet now, upon reflection, my heart remains cold. When my friend had earlier advised me, I viewed the minister's trust as something as fleeting as a bird on the roof. Now, it seems I have gained some of it. But in the recent words Aizawa spoke, there was mention of returning to my homeland and what might transpire if we continued in the same manner, though he did not reveal these things directly, as they were official matters. Even as a friend, he refrained from speaking openly about them. Now that I reflect, I wonder if I should have quickly informed the minister about my hasty decision to sever my relationship with Elis, a decision I made so recklessly. When I first arrived in Germany, I thought I had understood my true calling and swore not to become a mechanical person. But was it not like a bird whose feet had been bound, briefly flapping its wings and thinking it had gained freedom, without realizing that the strings on its legs had yet to be untied? Earlier, it was someone from my department, a high-ranking official, who had been pulling the strings, and now, alas, these strings are in the hands of the minister. When I returned to Berlin with the minister's party, it was precisely on the morning of the new year. After saying my farewells at the station, I took the carriage heading toward my home. Here, it is customary not to sleep on New Year's Eve, but to sleep on New Year's Day, so the entire city was eerily silent. The cold was intense, and the snow on the streets had turned into angular ice fragments, shimmering and sparkling as they reflected the clear sunlight. The carriage turned onto Crostel Street and stopped at the entrance of the house. At that moment, I heard the sound of a window opening, but I could not see inside from the carriage. As the coachman handed me my bag and I was about to climb the ladder, I encountered Elis, who was rushing down the ladder. She shouted once and threw her arms around my neck, and the coachman, with a bewildered expression, mumbled something through his beard, though I could not make out the words. "How glad I am that you have returned. Had you not returned, my life would have ended," she said. My heart was unsettled even at this moment. The longing for my homeland and the desire for success would, at times, have overshadowed my affection, but just in that fleeting moment, those conflicting thoughts faded away. I embraced her, and her head rested on my shoulder. Her joyful tears fell gently onto my shoulder. "How many steps shall we carry this up?" shouted the coachman, like the sound of a drum. He quickly climbed and stood on the ladder. Elis, who had come out to greet me, handed silver coins to her mother to reward the coachman. I took her hand, and, led by Elis, we hurried into the room. Upon a glance, I was astonished to see a large pile of white cotton and white lace stacked high on the desk. Elis, smiling as she pointed to the items, said, "What do you think of this arrangement?" As she picked up a piece of cotton cloth, I saw that it was a swaddling cloth. "Think of how happy my heart is. The child to be born will have eyes like yours, dark and beautiful. These eyes, it is only in my dreams that I have seen your dark eyes. When the child is born, may your noble heart ensure they never bear an improper name," she said, lowering her head. "You may laugh and call me childish, but how joyful I would be when the day comes to enter the temple," she said, with tears filling her eyes as she looked up. For the next few days, I did not visit the minister, reasoning that he must be tired from the journey. I stayed confined to the house. However, one evening, I was unexpectedly summoned by a messenger. When I arrived, the reception was most impressive. After inquiring about the hardships of the journey to Russia and offering comfort, the minister asked whether I still had no intention of returning east. "Your studies, I know well, but language alone will not be enough to serve the world. Since you have stayed so long, there may be various obligations awaiting you." When I asked Aizawa, he replied that there was no such matter, and I felt relieved. The atmosphere was not one that would have led to any further hesitation. I thought, how could this be? But it was hard to deny Aizawa's words, even if they were false. If I did not cling to this opportunity, I would lose my homeland, my path to restore my honor, and my life would be buried in the vast sea of people in the great cities of Europe. This thought struck my mind with such force. Ah, how unremarkable my heart was, as I replied, I understand, without much thought. Even though my brow was heavy with uncertainty, I would return and say something to Ellis. The confusion in my heart when I left the hotel was beyond comparison. I no longer knew the direction of east or west, and as I walked, lost in my thoughts, I was scolded several times by the coachman of passing carriages, startled and jumping aside each time. After a while, I suddenly looked around and realized that I had wandered to the vicinity of the zoo. I sat at the edge of the road, as if about to fall, leaning against a bench. My head burned as if it were scorched, and it rang as though struck by a hammer. I remained in that state for an unknown amount of time, feeling as though I were dead. When I finally regained my senses, I realized that the intense cold had pierced my bones. It was night, and the snow was falling heavily, accumulating in small amounts on the brim of my hat and the shoulder of my coat. It must have been past 11 o'clock. The tracks of the railroad carriage on Mohabbat and Carl Street were buried in snow, and the gas lamps near the Brandenburg Gate emitted a lonely light. When I tried to stand, my feet were frozen, so I rubbed them with both hands and finally managed to walk. Since my steps were slow, by the time I reached Crostell Street, it must have already been past midnight. I cannot remember how I walked the path that had brought me here. It was a night in early January, and though the taverns and tea houses along Unter den Linden were likely busy with people coming and going, I was oblivious to it all. In my mind, only the thought that I was an unforgivable sinner filled me entirely. Up in the attic on the 4th floor, Ela seemed not to have slept yet. A single bright star shone clearly in the dark sky, but it was quickly covered by snowflakes falling like herons. In an instant, it reappeared, fluttering in the wind like something played with. As I entered the doorway, fatigue overtook me, and the pain in my limbs became unbearable. I crawled up the ladder, unable to endure the pain any longer. I passed through the kitchen and opened the door to the room. When I entered, Elis, who had been sitting at the desk sewing the swaddling cloth, turned around and cried out, "Ah! What's happened to you? Your appearance," she exclaimed. It was no wonder she was shocked. My face, pale and almost lifeless, looked like that of a corpse. I had somehow lost my hat, and my hair was disheveled. After stumbling and falling several times on the road, my clothes were stained with mud and snow, and in places, they were torn. I tried to answer, but no sound came from my mouth. My knees trembled uncontrollably, and I could not bear to stand, so I reached for a chair but collapsed to the ground instead. I became aware of my surroundings after several days. I was delirious with fever, speaking only incoherently. While Elis carefully tended to me, one day, Izawa came to visit. After learning the details of what I had hidden from him, he reported only my illness to the minister, covering up everything else and ensuring that I was taken care of. When I first saw Elis beside my sickbed, I was shocked by her changed appearance. Over the past few weeks, she had become terribly thin, her bloodshot eyes were sunken, and her gray cheeks had hollowed out. With Izawa's help, we had not struggled with daily survival, but this benefactor had, in essence, destroyed her mentally. Later, I heard that when she met Izawa, she learned of the promise I had made to him, and also became aware of the agreement I had given to the minister that evening. Suddenly, she jumped up from her seat, her face turning as pale as the earth, and cried out, "My Toyotoro, have you deceived me to this extent?" She collapsed right there. Izawa called for her mother, and together they helped her lie down. After a while, when she woke, her eyes were fixed and she did not recognize those around her. She called my name and raged fiercely, tearing at her hair, biting the bedding, and suddenly searching for something, as though in a daze. Everything her mother tried to give her was thrown aside, but when she was given the swaddling cloth from the desk, she felt it, pressed it to her face, and began crying, tears streaming down. From that point on, there was no further commotion, but her mental faculties were nearly completely lost, and her behavior became as infantile as a newborn's. When shown to the doctor, it was diagnosed as a result of severe mental strain, a sudden onset of paranoia, with no prospects for recovery. When attempts were made to admit her to the asylum in Daldorf, she cried out in protest and would not listen. Later, she clung to the swaddling cloth, repeatedly taking it out to look at it, and each time she did, she would sigh deeply. I did not leave my sickbed, but even this seemed to be without consciousness. Occasionally, as if remembering something, she would repeatedly mutter, "Medicine, medicine." My illness was never fully healed. How many times did Elis, holding my living corpse, shed countless tears? When I returned east with the minister, Izawa and I arranged to provide Elis's mother with enough capital to sustain a modest living, and I entrusted her with the hope that the child left in the madwoman's womb would eventually be born. Ah! A good friend like Aizawa Kenkiki is rare to find in this world. Yet, even to this day, there remains a single point in my mind where I harbor a trace of resentment toward him.
Until we meet again, may the stories of Japan inspire your days. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales.